I've always known my voice was special, but nothing could have prepared me for the crazy journey that was about to begin. It was 1974, and I was back in Memphis, the city where it all started. The last time I played here was in 1961, and a lot had changed. I was older, the world was different, and my fans were hungry for more. The night of March 20th, the energy in the air was electric. The crowd was buzzing, and I could feel their excitement even before I stepped on stage. Ronnie Tutt, my drummer, kicked things off with his signature riff. No pomp, no frills, just pure music. The audience knew what was coming, and they roared with anticipation. CC Rider was the perfect opener. I threw myself into it, and the crowd responded with a fervor that felt like old times. My voice was strong, and there was none of that nasally sound that had bugged me during the Aloha concert. I was in great spirits, and it showed. I bantered with the audience, throwing in some jokes and laughs. It might not have been Shakespeare, but it made me feel like one of the guys again. Next up was I Got a Woman, which had become a staple in my shows. It segued into the spiritual Amen, and I let J.D. Sumner take the lead, his deep voice booming through the hall. We closed it out with a bluesy twist, and the crowd was eating it up. I played around with the melody on Love Me, and it felt fresh and powerful. The song had been on my live albums before, but this time it was different. I was having fun, and the audience could feel it. Trying to get to you was a treat. I'd been performing it live for a couple of years, but this was the first time it made it onto a live album. I poured everything into it, and it worked. The song built up the excitement, leading into the rock and roll medley. The band and I were tight, and we blasted through Long Tall Sally. Whole lot of shacking going on. Flip Flop and Fly, Your Mama Can't Dance, Jailhouse Rock, and Hound Dog in a whirlwind of energy. The ending of Hound Dog was a bit over the top, but who cares, the crowd loved it. Then came Why Me, Lord, with J.D. Sumner on lead. It turned into a kind of novelty number, but I gave it everything I had. The choruses were rousing, and I think it was one of the best versions I ever did. How Great Thou Art followed, and it was even more powerful than the studio version. I was completely focused, and the encore added even more intensity. The performance won a Grammy, and it was well-deserved. I Can't Stop Loving You was next, and I tagged a verse of Blueberry Hill to the beginning. It was a nice touch, and even though I was joking around, the song still hit hard. I wanted to show my home crowd that I was doing well, despite the hospital visit the year before. Help Me was a surprise inclusion, recorded live before the studio version was even released. The change of pace was welcome, and I sang it well. An American Trilogy was different this time around. It was faster, and the phrasing was new, but it still worked. Let Me Be There was a recent hit for Olivia Newton-John, and I loved the song. It had an upbeat country feel that was a great break from the rock and roll. The encore was a nice touch, and it was the right call to keep it on the album. Finally, My Baby Left Me. I rarely performed it live, but I gave it a full, serious treatment. It was a reminder of my early days, and the crowd appreciated it. The performance was heartfelt, and it felt like a fitting end to a night that brought me back to where it all began. The recording of that night was released as an album, and it was a hit. People loved it, and it was a reminder that even though things had changed, the magic was still there. The album was a mix of old and new, and it captured a moment in time that I'll never forget. But the real magic was in the room that night, with the crowd and the band and the music. It was a night that showed me I still had what it took, and it was a night that I'll always treasure. Elvis and we had a special connection, especially when it came to music. I remember the times when he would work his magic on stage, and it felt like he was singing just for me, but things weren't always smooth sailing. There were times when even Elvis, the king of rock and roll, faced some tough moments. In 1974, Elvis's live performances were hitting a high note. Songs like Lottie Miss Claudie and Can't Help Falling in Love showed how amazing he could be. He was giving one of his best performances since 1970, and the fans and critics loved it. People said it was like seeing a different Elvis, more relaxed and having a great time. But this magic didn't last forever. By May 1974, when Elvis played in Lake Tahoe, the shows weren't as special. They were okay, but nothing to write home about. The next tour was even tougher. Critics started to notice that Elvis wasn't his usual self. One critic, Jonathan Tackiff, wrote that Elvis seemed more like a showbiz act than the heartfelt performer he used to be. It was as if he was joking around with the audience instead of pouring his heart into his music. Elvis must have felt the pressure, because he spent more time rehearsing for his Las Vegas shows in August. He tried out new songs and even brought back some old favorites. The opening night was a bit of a mess. Elvis sounded tired and his speech was slurred, but things got better over the next few days. By the middle of the season, Elvis was back in form, and Variety wrote that he was in good voice and having a great time. However, as the season went on, Elvis's behavior became more erratic. He would talk more than sing, giving lectures on karate and even discussing a paternity suit from years ago. On the final night, Elvis had a big outburst. He was angry about rumors and said he'd never been strung out in his life. It was a bit scary to see him so upset, but the fans still loved him. In the fall of 1974, Elvis went on another tour, and his strange behavior continued. He claimed he was wearing a bulletproof vest, and sometimes he had trouble concentrating. Critics started to notice that the audience wasn't as happy as before. One reviewer wrote that people were leaving with subdued faces and muttering things like "rip-off." When Elvis turned 40 in January 1975, the press started to be really mean. They called him fat and 40 and made fun of him. Even the Los Angeles Times, which is usually pretty serious, joined in. Elvis was so worried about his weight and health that he postponed his Las Vegas shows and stayed at home for a while. In late January, Elvis had to go to the hospital. The reasons were a bit unclear, but it seemed like he was dealing with some liver issues. After a few weeks, he was back home and ready to record a new album. The sessions in March 1975 produced one of his best albums, Today. The album starts with Trouble, a high-energy rock song that reminded me of the old Elvis. And I Love You So was a beautiful ballad where Elvis really showed off his vocal skills. Susan When She Tried and Woman Without Love kept the country vibe going, and Elvis sounded great on both. Shake a Hand was a throwback to the 1950s, and Pieces of My Life was a dark, introspective song that felt like a mini autobiography. The last song, Fairytale, was a bit weaker, but it still had a nice country feel and became a regular part of Elvis's concert. Despite the ups and downs, Elvis always had a way of coming back and giving us some amazing music. Even when things got tough, he never stopped trying, and for that I'll always be grateful. I remember when Elvis came back to Las Vegas in March 1975. Everyone thought he would just stick to his old hits, but he surprised us all. He kept some of the newer songs he had been performing, like Promised Land and I Can Help. These songs added a fresh vibe to his shows. Elvis even included a fun cover of Little Darlin'. The whole set felt more relaxed and fun. Elvis even joked about his weight, saying he looked like Mama Cass the month before. It was nice to see him so at ease on stage. After Vegas, Elvis went on tour. Even though the shows were a bit more predictable, they were still good-humored and enjoyable. Some critics, like Jeff Klein from the Lakeland Ledger, didn't like it. He said Elvis looked tired and that the concert was passive, but the fans were furious. One fan, Tony Duor, wrote a letter defending Elvis, saying the review was unprofessional. The newspaper even had to print a follow-up to calm everyone down. It was a bit of a mess, but it showed how much Elvis meant to his fans. By the summer of 1975, it was clear Elvis was struggling. He had some erratic behavior on stage, and there was a famous incident where the Sweet Inspirations and Kathy Westmoreland left the stage because of something he said. But not all the shows were bad. At the Nassau Coliseum, Elvis gave one of his best performances. He even sat down at the piano and played You'll Never Walk Alone, which was amazing. It made you wonder why he couldn't always perform like that. The August Las Vegas shows were cut short because Elvis got sick again. He went to the hospital for 2 weeks and then tried to come back in December. The shows in December were surprisingly good. Variety said Elvis looked healthy and sounded cheerful. Robert Hilburn also gave a positive review, saying the performance avoided the sloppiness of some of his recent shows. But the speculation about Elvis's health continued. Articles started popping up, wondering what was wrong with him. One even suggested it was grotesque that Elvis, who never smoked or drank, was dealing with these issues. The first time fans really saw Elvis's decline on a record was with the album, From Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee. It was recorded in February 1976 in a makeshift studio at Graceland. The first song they recorded was Bitter They Are, Harder They Fall. Elvis sounded good, and it was a solid start. She Thinks I Still Care was another country song they recorded, but Elvis's voice sounded a bit older and thicker. The vibrato was a bit out of control, but he still seemed committed to the song. One of the oddest choices was The Last Farewell, a hit for Roger Whittaker. It was a bit strange to hear Elvis singing as an Englishman, but he did a decent job. The overdubs helped bring the song to life. The next night, they worked on Solitaire. This one didn't go well. The arrangement was too heavy, and Elvis's voice was in poor shape. He overdid the chorus, and it just didn't work. Even the earlier, rougher takes were better. It's a shame because it showed how trying too hard can sometimes backfire. That night, when we tried to record I'll Never Fall in Love Again, it was tough. Elvis's voice sounded muffled, like he had cotton stuffed in his cheeks during the verses. When it came to the choruses, he just couldn't get the power he wanted. It was loud, but it came off as shouting. He sounded tired and old, and the final, again, was strained, almost pitiful. It was a far cry from his performances just a few years earlier. Later that same night, we worked on Moody Blue. This song mixed disco and country, and while Elvis's voice still had some issues like his breathing and a bit of wild vibrato, it was mostly hidden under the layers of strings. Despite the vocal problems, Elvis gave a good performance, and Moody Blue became the title track of his last album released during his life. For the Heart was a bit more upbeat, a country rock song written by the same guy who did Burning Love. Elvis's producer, Felton Jarvis, had worked on a country version of the song with Teresa Brewer the year before. Listening to both, it was clear that Elvis was running on empty. Brewer's version was bright and lively, but Elvis's was heavy and slow. He had trouble hitting the high notes and sometimes fell behind the beat. It was a sad performance. Hurt became a regular part of Elvis's live shows from March 1976 until his last performances in June 1977. One writer said the song was dated, and the music was crude. Elvis tried to belt it out like he did with Rags to Riches in 1970, but it didn't work. His voice just wasn't there. He had the volume, but no energy or color. He struggled to hit the high notes, and it didn't translate well on record, even though it worked live. Danny Boy was the opposite. Elvis stripped the song down and gave it a gospel feel. His voice was quiet and sincere, and he controlled his vibrato much better than before. This was Elvis the artist, not just someone trying to get through the songs. The arrangement was simple and intimate, and it turned out to be one of his last great recordings. His recent problems added a melancholy tone that suited the song, and it felt like he knew something about the lyrics' sadness. The next night, we tried two more ballads, Never Again and Love Coming Down. Elvis's control from Danny Boy was gone. His vibrato was all over the place, especially in Never Again. Love Coming Down was a bit better, but neither song was great, and Elvis's voice didn't help. On the final night, we tackled Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. Despite some weird production choices, it was one of the better recordings from the session. Elvis's voice was better, and the upbeat arrangement helped him keep his vibrato in check. When From Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee, came out in May 1976, fans were shocked. They could hear how much Elvis's voice had changed. The album cover tried to hide his weight gain and aging, but it didn't work. Critics weren't interested, and even the usually positive variety admitted it was mainly for die-hard fans. It felt like RCA was reminding everyone of Elvis's past greatness by releasing Elvis, a Legendary Performer, Volume 2. It was a collection of old hits and live performances, including some from the Singer Presents Elvis TV special. One reviewer said the young Elvis's voice didn't show much promise, and the collection didn't provide much insight into his development. But a few months later, the Sun Sessions came out, a collection of his early Sun recordings. At a time when Elvis's new work was losing its shine, this album was a reminder of his historical importance. In 1976, Elvis toured a lot, even though there were concerns about his health and mindset. The first tour was surprisingly good. He added Hurt to his set list and sometimes surprised the audience with old songs like Until It's Time for You to Go and Steamroller Blues. In Cincinnati, Elvis split his trousers and had to leave the stage to change. A columnist wrote a harsh review, comparing Elvis to Raymond Burr because of his weight. Fans were upset and wrote angry letters, but Elvis seemed in good spirits. He brought the torn jumpsuit back on stage, laughed about it, and gave an enjoyable show. For the next 6 months, the tours continued, but nothing new was added to the set lists. The band introductions and solos took up more time, leaving less for Elvis. Sometimes, like in Memphis on July 5th, he showed hints of his old self. He told the audience he had all the time they wanted and defied his critics by performing That's All Right with energy. But by the end, he was completely drained. Most of the time, the shows were just okay, and sometimes they were disasters. Elvis seemed half asleep and barely able to speak. Critics were torn between overlooking his shortcomings and expressing disappointment. One review called his performance unambitious and said he was indifferent. Another described him as weak and suggested people went to see him more out of respect for the past than for new music. There was a sadness in these reviews, a longing for the 1950s and the young Elvis who symbolized rebellion. One critic wrote about the let's pretend element of the show, where the audience pretended Elvis was still young and they were still teenagers. Another reviewer said Elvis was not much of a showman. In October 1976, we had another recording session at Graceland. Elvis was in better voice, but he wasn't very focused. The first song, It's Easy for You, was a sad song by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. Elvis's voice was clear and he gave a good performance, but the production was strange. The song started with Elvis sounding far away, and then he was brought closer as it went on. It didn't work well, but the alternate takes sounded better. Way Down was a mix of disco and rock. It became Elvis's last great recording, and a big hit after his death. He seemed to enjoy it, and the song was unlike anything he had done before. It would have been great for live shows, but he never performed it on stage. I remember when I first heard Pledging My Love. It was a big hit for Johnny Ace back in 1954, but when Elvis sang it, it was like he was living the song. The version they released was short, under 3 minutes, but the unedited master was almost 5 minutes long. You could hear Elvis really enjoying himself, singing the bridge and the final verse over and over. It was like he didn't want to let the song go. He'll Have to Go was one of the last songs Elvis recorded in the studio. It was another classic from the 1950s, and Elvis gave it a nice country feel. The track was longer than most of his recordings, and it made me think that an album where Elvis revisited songs from the 1950s would have been a great idea. Around this time, he was also singing Unchained Melody and Little Darlin' in his concerts. These older songs seemed to really capture his interest. The recording session only produced 4 completed masters, which wasn't enough for a full album. They set up another session in Nashville in January 1977, but Elvis never showed up. That meant the next album was only half finished, and it marked the end of Elvis's recording career. The final tours of 1976 were actually better than some of his earlier shows. In Chicago at the stadium, Elvis looked slimmer and his voice sounded stronger. He gave more controlled and careful performances than earlier in the year. The New Year's Eve show in Pittsburgh was especially good, and it felt like it could have been Elvis's last great show. But in between these tours, Elvis seemed bored and tired, especially in Las Vegas. Critics often talked about Elvis's age, even though he was only in his early 40s. They wrote things like, if Elvis is 41 years old, his voice doesn't reflect it, and wondered if he could still be sexy at 42 with a weight problem. It was as if they were talking about someone much older. Maybe it was because he had been in the public eye for so long, or maybe it was because of the health problems reported over the past few years. By the first tour of 1977, the quality of Elvis's shows had dropped again. He was still trying, singing songs like Reconsider Baby and Moody Blue, but he sounded out of breath and tired. His speech was often slurred, and it was clear that something was wrong. In April 1977, producer Felton Jarvis had to record Elvis on tour because he wouldn't go into the studio. They only managed to capture 3 new songs. Unchained Melody was one of them, and it was amazing to hear Elvis play the piano live. The recording was great, but a lot of the magic came from the overdubs. Little Darlin' was a fun, jokey performance, but it didn't fit well on the album. If You Love Me, Let Me Know was a weak song, and Elvis's performance didn't help much. These 3 songs ended up on the Moody Blue album, which came out in June 1977. Despite the challenges, the album was better than the previous one, and the artwork was classier. Even though some critics like Robert Hilburn and Dave Marsh weren't impressed, fans loved it. After Elvis died, the album was seen in a different light, with some calling it one of his best. But the concerts in the spring of 1977 were really bad. Elvis was struggling to sing, and his performances were often shocking. Songs like Lottie Miss Claudie and Bridge Over Troubled Water were labored, and his arrangements were slower and bare. His appearance was getting worse, and the reviews were harsh. One critic called him a parody of his past performances, and another wrote that he has a bulge around his waist, that he can't play the guitar, that he mumbles at times, and that the old pelvis movement isn't what it once was. Despite the bad reviews, fans still supported Elvis. When a critic in Toledo wrote a negative review, fans were angry and wrote letters to the newspaper. They said it was unfair to write those things about Elvis, even if it was true. But the poor reviews kept coming, and it was clear that something was seriously wrong. In June 1977, a deal was made for a new TV special, but it was a risky move. The first show they recorded was a mess, with Elvis slurring his words and barely able to sing. The second show was a bit better, but it was still poor. The TV special aired in October 1977, and a double LP of the concerts was released at the same time. The songs on the album were a mix of good and bad. CC Rider and That's All Right were solid, but Are You Lonesome Tonight and How Great Thou Art were difficult to listen to. I Really Don't Want to Know and Hurt were better, but the overall quality was low. The TV special and the album were a bittersweet end to Elvis's career. They showed that he was still trying, but his health and voice were failing him. It was a sad time, and it was hard to imagine what might have happened if he had lived longer. But even in his last performances, there were moments that reminded us of the incredible talent that Elvis Presley had been. It's Now or Never was a song I really wished I hadn't heard Cheryl Nielsen sing first. Her version was so over the top that Elvis's performance, which was just okay, felt like a breath of fresh air. Elvis had trouble with his vibrato, but it still sounded way better than Nielsen's. The arrangement was cheesy, but Elvis's voice was like a ray of sunshine cutting through the fog. Trying to Get to You was a step down from the 1974 version, but it wasn't bad. The quality of Elvis's voice went up and down throughout the song. At times he sounded like he was struggling, but then suddenly he'd hit a powerful note and you'd forget about the struggles. It was a roller coaster ride, but one that kept you hooked. Before the Hawaiian Wedding song, Elvis tried to tell some jokes, but it was painful to listen to. He just wasn't a natural comedian. The song itself wasn't much better. It's tough to sing a tender ballad, and Elvis really struggled with the softness required. He did better with songs where he could belt out the notes. Fairy Tale was heartbreaking to listen to. Elvis sounded so tired, and it was hard to believe this was the same guy who recorded the studio version just 2 years earlier. I couldn't understand how this song made it onto the album. It was a stark reminder of how much Elvis had changed. Little Sister, which came next, was another tough one. Elvis's voice was all over the place, and it was hard to tell if he was trying to push through or if he was just having a bad night. It was a far cry from his earlier performances. Early Morning Rain, one of the songs from Elvis's intro of the band, was the best of the 3. But even this song, which should have been a showcase for Elvis's softer side, was a struggle. He just couldn't deliver the gentle, restrained vocal it needed. And I Love You So was the last song on the original double album, and it was a rough one. Elvis tried his best, but he was having a hard time with his breathing, pitch, and vibrato. It was a tough way to end the album. Unchained Melody wasn't on the album or the TV special, but it was released as a single after Elvis died. Watching the video was both mesmerizing and sad. You could see Elvis struggling, but he made it through with a mix of determination and bravado. It wasn't his best, but it was a powerful performance. The TV special that aired in October 1977 was a shock to the world. Elvis looked and sounded like a different person. He was overweight, and his movements were awkward. It was a far cry from his earlier performances, and it was hard to watch. But even then, you could see that he was trying his best. Critics and fans alike were left with a mix of sadness and disbelief. Elvis's last performance was on June 26, 1977, and he died less than 2 months later. The news hit the world hard. Some newspaper reports seemed to take a bit of pleasure in it, but most were respectful. Molly Ivins in the New York Times talked about how Elvis's voice and style changed popular music. John Rockwell suggested that Elvis didn't invent rock and roll, but he defined it. Variety wrote about how Elvis paved the way for the Beatles and changed youth culture in the 1950s. One of the most touching tributes came from a 27-year-old fan named Michael Coates. He wrote that even though Elvis had his artistic weaknesses, especially during the 1960s when he was doing mostly movie soundtracks, what mattered most was his legacy as a pioneer. He was a legend, and no one else could replace him. In the years after Elvis's death, RCA struggled to decide how to release new material. The first posthumous album, Elvis in Concert, was particularly damaging. It showed Elvis at his worst, and the TV special that went along with it was even worse. But RCA kept going, releasing various collections of live performances, alternate takes, and forgotten master recordings. The Elvis Aaron Presley boxed set in 1980 was a game changer. It was a big 8 LP set that included a lot of historically significant material, even if some of it was in poor sound quality. It showed that RCA was willing to release material that was important, even if it wasn't perfect. In 1984, RCA released a Golden Celebration, a set that focused mostly on Elvis's 1950s material. It included home recordings and outtakes from his early years, giving fans a glimpse into the making of a legend. Despite the ups and downs, Elvis's legacy lived on. Even as his popularity waned in the years after his death, he remained a cultural icon, and his influence continued to be felt in music and beyond. I remember the 1980s as a time when Elvis's music started to get really confusing. The releases were all over the place, and it was hard to know what was good and what wasn't. The Greatest Hits Volume 1 came out, and it had a mix of live recordings and studio tracks. Some of the songs didn't even fit the Greatest Hits title, like the extended version of The Sound of Your Cry. It was a bit of a mess, to be honest. Then, in 1982, they released Memories of Christmas, which had alternate, unedited, and undubbed versions of songs. It was like they were just throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. In 1983, they released the 4th volume of the Legendary Performer series, and it was actually pretty good. It had some new songs, live performances from Madison Square Garden in 1972, and even some home recordings. It was a breath of fresh air in the middle of all the chaos. Around this time, Greg Geller took over as the producer of Elvis's albums from Joan Deary. Geller had a different approach. He wanted to build albums around Elvis's best work, like the 1950s, the 1969 Memphis sessions, and his blues recordings. He was more focused on highlighting Elvis's artistic achievements rather than just releasing whatever was available. But the real game changer came from Europe. In the early 1990s, an album called Essential Elvis, the first movies, came out. It was produced by Roger Semin, with research by Ernst Jorgensen and Todd Slaughter. This album featured master takes and alternate versions of songs from Elvis's early movies like Love Me Tender, Loving You, and Jailhouse Rock. When RCA picked it up for an international release, it marked a turning point in how they handled Elvis's legacy. By 1991, 2 more volumes of Essential Elvis had been released, covering recordings from early 1957 and 1958. Along with this, RCA started releasing more detailed and expanded versions of Elvis's live performances, like the alternate Aloha Concert, the $1 Million Quartet, and the NBC TV special soundtrack. It felt like they were finally taking Elvis seriously and showcasing his artistic side. The 1990s were a golden era for Elvis releases. The Elvis in the 90s series saw most of his original albums appearing on CD in remastered form. The soundtracks were repackaged and sometimes remixed in a series called double features. They even released lavish box sets that focused on different decades of Elvis's career. One of the highlights was the 1997 release of Platinum, A Life in Music, a 4-CD set that told Elvis's story through alternate takes and unreleased material. It was followed by Today, Tomorrow, and Forever, another 4-CD set that, while not as strong as Platinum, still delivered a lot of unreleased performances that fans were craving. For me, as a teenager, this was the perfect time to become a fan. I could build my collection with the original albums on CD, and the catalog was uncluttered and logically structured. It made it easy to appreciate just how much great music Elvis made in all 3 decades of his career. In the late 1990s, a new label called Follow that Dream FTD was set up specifically for collectors. Named after Elvis's 1962 film, FTD has released nearly 200 albums, many of them double CD, containing a large amount of officially unreleased material. At first, the releases were well structured, like the Essential Elvis series, and focused on outtakes from movie soundtracks, the 1960s Nashville recordings, the 1969 Memphis sessions, and the 1970 and 1976 Jungle Room session. There were also live recordings, mostly from the 1970s, including soundboard recordings and unreleased professional performances from 1969, 1970, 1972, and 1977. But as time went on, FTD started to release more and more albums that were labeled as classic albums. These were mostly double disc sets featuring the original album in its original order, followed by bonus material, mostly alternate takes. This is where things got a bit muddled. For example, Love Letters from Elvis, released in 1971, is not exactly one of Elvis's strongest albums. It was made up of leftovers from a big recording session the year before, and is more memorable for its strange overdubs than Elvis's singing. Despite this, it got the classic album treatment, with multiple alternate takes of each song. This kind of release can be confusing for new fans. If someone picks up a classic album like Love Letters from Elvis or Elvis now without knowing much about Elvis, they might wonder why he's considered a legend. It can skew the view of his really great work. Almost all of Elvis's non-soundtrack albums have been given classic album status, which can make it hard to see what his best work really is. The live recordings from the 1970s are even more complicated. Ernst Jorgensen, who was in charge of FTD, said they would eventually release a show from every Vegas or Tahoe season and most tours. This has led to the release of some concerts where Elvis wasn't at his best. For example, the 2003 release of Dragonheart, a soundboard recording from October 1st, 1974, showed Elvis in a weak moment. Some fans were disappointed, saying his voice was flat and he struggled to hold notes. But other fans defended it, saying they loved it regardless. Since then, FTD has released more concerts from Elvis's later years, some of which show him in even worse form. For instance, the 2011 release of Amarillo 77 was from a tour where Elvis should have been in the hospital. One fan wrote that it wasn't a great loss to have this album. FTD is in a tough spot. They're trying to meet the demands of hardcore fans who want every second of Elvis, but these releases can affect how future generations view him. Many of these recordings are now on YouTube, so they're not staying within the fan community. It raises the question, just because fans want every bit of Elvis, should they get it? Is it right to release multiple concerts from the same season or tour, even if the quality isn't great? While FTD has been catering to the collectors, the retail market for Elvis's music has become a mess. There are over 100 Elvis compilations available, and many of his original albums are only available in big box sets. The Legacy Edition series, which should have been deluxe versions of his key albums, has become a series of twofers with little connection to the main album. For example, the Elvis Country Legacy Edition includes an extra disc of Love Letters from Elvis, which doesn't really fit. The Today album in the Legacy Edition series is another example. It has an extra disc of soundboard recordings from the 1980 Elvis Presley box set, which has nothing to do with the main album. It's a missed opportunity and shows a lack of care in programming. Despite all the great discoveries and releases since Elvis's passing, his core work, his hundreds of songs released during his lifetime, has somehow gotten lost in the shuffle. It feels like his music is often treated as a commodity, a way to make a quick buck with each new compilation or reissue. It's a shame because Elvis's place in cultural history is secure, but his legacy deserves better. So after all this talk about Elvis and his music, it's clear that things have gotten a bit messy over the years. Sony, the company that now owns Elvis's music, has been putting out a ton of stuff, but not always in the best way. It's like they're more interested in making money than in making sure new fans can actually enjoy Elvis's music the way it was meant to be. When I look at all the reissues and compilations, it feels like they're just trying to sell the same songs over and over again in different packages. It's confusing for anyone who's just trying to get into Elvis's music. You end up with a bunch of albums that are hard to figure out, and it's tough to know where to start. Back in the 1990s, they did a great job with the 3 big box sets that covered the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Those sets were perfect for anyone who wanted to understand just how amazing Elvis's music really is. But now it feels like we're drowning in a sea of endless reissues and compilations. I think what Elvis really needs is a fresh start. The record label needs to clean up the mess, get rid of all the unnecessary greatest hits packages, and focus on the essential stuff. They should make it easy for people to discover Elvis's music, to hear the great songs and albums that made him a legend. Elvis was more than just a guy with a cool voice and a flashy wardrobe. He was an artist who changed music forever. It would be a shame if all the great things he did got lost in a bunch of confusing reissues. I hope that one day, people will be able to see Elvis for the incredible musician he was, and not just for the stereotypes and myths that have grown around him. It's not too late to make things right, but it's going to take some work. We need to bring back the focus on the music, and make it easy for new fans to discover why Elvis is still so important today. If we can do that, then maybe Elvis will be remembered for the right reasons, and his legacy will live on in the best possible way.